All right. Good to see y'all. We're going to think together about the problem of anxiety for a little bit. So I've got enough content for me to carry on for much longer than an hour. This is a subject I've done a lot of work in, but I'm very happy also to talk at any time. So we don't need to get through the full amount. So if you would like to ask a question, if you would like to discuss something, if you'd like to say, hey, can we go into that a bit more? Feel free to shout out. I don't mind at all. So we're going to think together. We're going to be simple, but also complicated and ask, what is anxiety? Which is a simple question to ask, but a hard question to answer. And then we're going to ask, why are we so anxious? So why are modern people like us, 21st century people, so incredibly anxious, which is statistically the reality? And then we're going to look at a deeper dive scripturally into what anxiety is to help us answer that question. And then finally, I'll give just a few things you can do. So a few ways to tackle this great problem of anxiety in your life. There's no magic pill to take. Anxiety is something that has to be treated over long periods of time. And so we're going to be looking at that towards the end. Okay? So, all right, first, what is it? All right. What I want to do is go to the experts, the psychologist, the psychiatrist first, and then come to what Scripture says about it and look at how those definitions compare. There's a book called The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychology and Psychiatry, the DSM. It's the most famous book on psychology in the world. It's produced in the United States, but it's an international work. Every so often they come out with another one. We're on round number 5 right now, the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is the go-to for anybody that studies in this field. So this is what the DSM-5 says about anxiety. It says that anxiety is a fear, and it's a fear where we have an emotional response to a real or perceived threat. Okay, so they say it's an emotional fear where we're having a response to a perceived or real threat. Okay, so the big takeaway there is to see that the experts say that anxiety is a type of fear. It's a type of fear that you experience when there's threat in your life. All right, now, I want to say yes to that, but that it's not nuanced enough. It's not nearly nuanced enough. Okay, so I'm going to give you my definition of anxiety that I've kind of cultivated over the past 10 years or so. And it's not going to be easy to understand when you listen to it the first time, but then we'll talk about it, and it will become easy, I think. Okay, so here's the definition. Anxiety is an emotion of fear where we use the capacity of the human imagination to construe hypothetical circumstances of loss, which then manifest in soul and body as angst and various forms of illness. All right? I'll read it one more time, then I'll explain it. Okay, here it is again. Anxiety is an emotion of fear where we use the capacity of our human imagination to construe hypothetical circumstances of loss, which then manifest in soul and body as angst and various forms of illness. Okay, now, here's what I mean. The DSM has it partially right. They say that anxiety is an emotion in response to fear in our lives. And that's definitely the case, right? However, they don't get specific enough. Okay, so let me give you some examples. Let's say that you're in the city center of Edinburgh, you're on Princess Street. I don't know where everybody's from here, but I'm assuming you've all been to Princess Street in Edinburgh, probably. And you're crossing the street and you've not waited for the green man, like we all do. You just go for it. But then you realize that you did what? You mistimed it. And the bus, the number 36 is coming way faster than you had reckoned. And what do you do in that moment? Well, you become faster than you've ever been, right? And your heart is racing. What does your body do? Your physical response, your autonomic nervous system triggers, the adrenaline pumps, and you do what you need to do to survive. Okay, now, under the DSM's definition, that's anxiety. It's a fear based on an imminent threat, a real threat that triggers your autonomic nervous system. Okay, but I want to say that is not anxiety. That's not anxiety, right? We all know that. What is that? What might we call that instead? Instinct, right? It's actually the gift of God, right? God in a broken, fallen, cursed world gives us instinct, fear. You see, fear is a gift whenever sin enters the world. We must be afraid. Prior to sin, the only type of fear there is the fear of the Lord, which is turning to God in a sort of weightiness and awe, respecting his weightiness, his gravity. But after the curse comes into the world, fear is a gift. It's what we call a common grace gift of God. You need it. So I have 4 children. I see my 3-year-old sticking a fork into the electrical socket, as I've seen on several occasions. And what do I do? I race over. I do everything I can to keep him alive, right? And that's not anxiety. That's the proper and appropriate response of fear. My autonomic nervous system is triggered. I'm trying to survive. I want him to survive. Okay, and so that's why we have to be more specific than the DSM. So we could talk about then things like stress, worry, and fear, which I want to say to you are different than anxiety. All right, so people will talk about stress or worry and conflate that with the concept of anxiety. I'm stressed, I'm anxious. Actually, they're different, right? What's the difference? Okay, well, let me put it in terms like this. It may not be instinctual fear that's keeping you alive, that type of fear. But what's stress? Well, stress is when, maybe some of you, I'm sure some of you are university students, or you've been through university, and, the exam season is coming. The dissertation season is in full force, and it's due on Friday. This is due on the next week. And you are facing a situation where if you don't perform, you will fail, right? And what do we call that? You are, what? Stressed. Now, that's not anxiety. That's actually an appropriate concern. There's a real reason to be stressed in that moment. You're facing the clock. You might not make it. You're going to fail. You could lose your job. If it's that sort of situation, you could lose your degree. There's a level of concern in our lives that's entirely appropriate. The question is, what do we do with it? Now, what you do with it can make something into anxiety. That's the difference. So stress, worry, and instinctual fears are not anxieties, right? The question is, what do you do with those things? And so here's the difference. Anxiety is where you allow the emotion of fear to run wild in your imagination, right? So some authors have put it, you play the prophet. You start to become the prophet. In other words, you start to imagine future scenarios of absolute loss, and you read those backwards. So how does stress become anxiety? Well, you're facing the situation that you have, this presentation due at your workplace, and it's going to be the determination between whether you're going to keep your job or not. You have this dissertation due. It's going to be the determining factor in whether you pass the degree or not, right? But what makes that into anxiety? Well, what makes it into anxiety is when you are facing a real threat, and you know the parameters of that threat, and you allow your mind and your heart, your imagination, the world of imagination, to run like crazy into the worst possible scenarios. And you play those out in every possible way to the point where it actually triggers an autonomic nervous response in you that becomes what the philosophers called angst emotionally and physical illness, literally. Okay? So you're facing the dissertation issue, you might fail, and you start to think, I'm going to be homeless. That's letting your hypothetical imagination run wild, right? If I don't do this, then what is going to happen? Well, I'm going to be alone forever. If I don't get this relationship, then I'm going to die at 95 years old, never having had the person that I wanted. All sorts of things, right, that you can take. A scenario where there is an imminent threat, one that might cause you stress and worry, and you allow it to become a prophetized. You play the prophet, and you allow it to go crazy in your mind. Now, what this literally does to you is it does the same thing that you crossing the street and the bus might hit you does. Okay, so if the bus is about to hit you, your body will respond. Its autonomic nervous system will respond. It will trigger. You will produce more adrenaline than normal. You will do all sorts of things. And when you are anxious, so when you are allowing your hypothetical imagination to run wild about any circumstance, it does the same thing to your body. Okay, so what's the first way that people often know they're anxious? Well, they don't know, they might not be able to admit up front, I'm anxious. Instead, what might they notice? Palms are sweaty, Your heart is racing. Said
Stomach.
your stomach. You have stomach issues. You're going to the toilet too often. To be quite literal, right? All sorts of things are happening. That's actually what happens to our bodies when we're anxious. And when you're anxious and anxious and anxious and anxious, it snowballs and actually can become long-term physical illness. Right? So there's plenty of people that have triggered long-term physical illnesses due to anxiety, right? And it's because anxiety actually has a physical effect on you. It does. It's an emotion. It's an issue of the spirit and the soul that becomes physical over time as we allow it to play out. Right? It actually wears down our soul and therefore wears down our body at the exact same time. Okay? Now, the Bible. That's the experts. That's my take on it. The Bible. The Bible treats this issue quite frequently. So all across the New Testament, there's a specific Hebrew word in the Old Testament that's often translated fear, but has a connotation in the context that it's clear it's talking about anxiety. And in the New Testament, there are multiple times where a particular Greek word is used for anxiety. The word is merimnao. It doesn't matter that you know that, but that's the word. 28 times it's used in the New Testament. And we have a number of places. You'll remember probably the most famous one, Matthew chapter 6. Jesus says to the disciples at the pinnacle of the Sermon on the Mount, do not be anxious, right? Don't you know that I clothe the lilies, that I count every single sparrow? Don't be anxious, okay? Philippians 4 is a very famous moment. Be anxious for nothing, right? And there's others. There's one in 1 Peter 5. There's several famous moments in the Bible. But what I want to say before I get into that, we're actually going to come back around to that in my third point. Let me wrap up this first one by saying that the Bible understands a psychology that modern psychology has come to recently. Ancients understood what we've only started talking about in the 20th century as modern people. And that's that we're incredibly complex, and that what happens in the soul affects the body, and what happens in the body affects the soul. Okay? Now we call this, let me give you the word that we use in theology for this. Okay? It's psychosomatic holism. Psycho, as in psychological, psycho. Somatic. Soma is the Greek word for body. S-O-M-A, soma. So psychosomatic holism. Meaning, what's a human being? What's a human being? Well, we get it wrong as Christians, and we have very often, when we think that the true self is the soul separate from the body. Okay, that's sort of what we might call a Greek or Gnostic idea that's been put into the Christian imagination that shouldn't be there. Right? How did God make humanity? Adam and Eve, the first man and woman. He created them, male and female, embodied souls. Never meant to be separated. Okay? What are you? You are your body and your soul. Yourself is your body and your soul together. Anytime your body and your soul are separated, that's called death. All right? So even having your soul separate from your body in the heavenly condition is a death state. It's not the goal. What's the goal of Christianity? New body. Resurrection is the goal, right? That's the point, right? And so that means that true humanity is embodied souls. And that means that God has very intentionally from the beginning made it to where our bodies and our souls are so connected that if you do something wrong in the soul, it affects the body, and do something wrong in the body, it affects the soul, of course. And all of you know this, right? That sickness plays out in your emotional life plays out into sickness. We want our doctors to see this more and more as they are more and more, that these things affect one another. And there couldn't be a more prime example of this, a more case in point example than anxiety. Anxiety does this to us very clearly. Now, the Bible says this. Listen to Proverbs 14:30. A tranquil heart, here it is, listen. A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy will make your bones rot. Now it's talking about psychosomatic holism. A tranquil, peaceful heart actually gives life to your physical body. Envy makes your bones rot. The writer says here in Proverbs 14:30. So the Bible understands that we're psychosomatic wholes and that we're very complex creatures, that we're embodied souls. And so anxiety is a factor of environmental factors, biological factors, nature and nurture, personal decisions, products of actions that have been committed against you and also by you. All of this plays in to anxiety. Now, what I want to say to qualify is that what I want to talk about the rest of the time is nothing but what I would call common anxiety. This is a designation that psychologists will use. An anxiety that probably most of us experience, that's not, here's the difference. Common anxiety and the other category, diagnosable anxiety disorders. Okay, so I want to leave and push away. I'm not talking about diagnosable anxiety disorders. Right? Some of you may have had that. Many people have had diagnosable anxiety disorders. There's all sorts of phobias and anxiety disorders that can be diagnosed and often ought to be. And they need to be treated and talked about. What I want to say is I don't want to talk about those today. I want to talk about the most common level thing, which is, for most of us, anxieties that we experience all the time, but we're never probably going to be medicated or treated for them necessarily, although we could be, and that would not be bad at all. Okay? Because the reason I want to do that and qualify that is because when you get into diagnosable anxiety disorders, the complexity rises to such a degree that you really need to talk about them specifically, or it can be unhelpful. Right? So don't hear me saying that I'm talking about every possible anxiety. There are anxieties out there, for example, anxiety disorders that develop in complete response to being a victim of a great sin. Right? So you can be the victim of a grave evil and develop an anxiety disorder that has very little to do with what I'm going to talk about today. It's a much different issue. Okay? So what I'm doing is something different than that. So what I want to say is that in the Bible, common anxiety and fear are so tied together, so wed together, that the Bible is telling us all this long before the experts ever came into the picture. So let me move on by just giving you one more example from Scripture. It's from Jeremiah 17:8. Listen to this. This is Hebrew poetry. And oftentimes in Hebrew poetry, what happens is the poet, Jeremiah in this instance, puts together two lines that you're meant to see are symmetrical. It's speaking about the same thing. So listen for this. You'll hear it, okay? Jeremiah is riffing off Psalm 1 here. He's talking about the blessed person. What does it mean to be blessed? It says, he is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream, and he does not fear when the heat comes out. Right? So there's one line. He does not fear, the blessed man does not fear when the heat comes out. What's the heat, you think? That's right? Yeah, circumstances of any kind. The heat comes out. You're a tree, and how do you stay green when the heat comes? When the circumstances of life are horrible, you're suffering. Right? That's the issue there. Here's the second line. This is the parallel line. Okay, we call this parallelism. It's saying the exact same thing in a different way. And he is not anxious in the year of drought. Right. So the second line uses the word anxiety and says, If you're a blessed person, you've got your roots planted in deep water so that when the heat comes, you stay green. And therefore, you are not anxious in the year of the drought. Right? Same thing, meaning fear in the first line and anxiety in the second line are synonyms. So the Bible's saying to you, anxiety is a type of fear. There are good fears, there are bad fears. You need some fears, you got to do away with some fears. And anxiety is one of those fears that you've got to fight to put away out of your life. If you jump to the 20th century and read the psychologists or the philosophers, they'll call this, they'll sometimes refer to anxiety as neurotic fear. And there was a movement in the 20th century in French philosophy and German philosophy, both. You don't need to know the details about it for this point, but they tried and I think very successfully got to the bottom of this in the same way that the Bible does. And what they said, what one particular thinker, Martin Heidegger, a German guy, he said that anxiety really is reading the ultimate loss of life backwards into every little potential loss that you face in your life. All right, so what's the ultimate? Death. They said the reason anxiety exists is because of death. And we take the reality of death, that we will die, and we read it backwards into every little moment in life. And we construe all the little hypothetical deaths, relationships, jobs, financial securities, whatever it may be. And it's all in the context, the neurosis that's been created, because we face a reality. We are going to lose ourselves. We're going to lose ourselves in death. And so that's the context within which anxiety rises up. All right, that's very important because that means we've got to think about death. We'll come back to that at the end. All right, that's the first thing. Second thing. Let me stop there and ask, does anybody want to ask anything or say anything briefly or clarify if you want some clarification? Are you okay?
Cory, could you read your definition?
Yeah, sure. So anxiety is an emotion of fear when we use the capacity of the human imagination to construe hypothetical circumstances of loss. We play the prophet. Things that aren't actually happening, we make it up. Right? Then that manifests in our soul and our body as both angst and various forms of illness. Okay? All right, so now let me sidestep and ask a different question before we get a little deeper into that definition. Why is anxiety so prevalent today? Why are we so anxious? Now, I don't know everybody in the room at all. I think Molly's the only person. Well, I know a couple of you, but that's it. I don't know how you face anxiety, but statistically, we are very anxious. You are very anxious statistically. Okay. In 1947, W.H. Auden, one of the famous British poets that moved to America, wrote a poem called "The Age of Anxiety." It was an epic poem. It won the Pulitzer Prize at the time, and his little phrase, "The Age of Anxiety," has been used as the definition of our age. We live in the age of anxiety. People want to talk today a lot about how we're anxious. We're more anxious than ever. Why? Well, people will say things like, well, it's because of COVID-19. We're so anxious because of COVID. Now, COVID was a circumstance that raised the level of anxiety internationally, undoubtedly. But you can't go to something like that and say, a circumstance has made us much more anxious. A circumstance like COVID-19, for a couple of reasons. One, we can hold two things together, I think, fairly. One is COVID-19 was has been a horrible thing for the global society in all sorts of ways. Obviously, physically, in terms of the death toll, economically. I mean, the list could go down 1,000 miles, right? However, there have been worse plagues upon the land, historically, much worse. And people have been less anxious in the midst of them. Now, the second thing is this. Statistically, we have been more anxious since really the 1950s. So what we have from something like the American Psychological Association and other places is that people have been becoming more anxious, diagnosably anxious, consistently since the close of World War II. So every single decade, anxiety diagnoses have risen dramatically. But even at the level of common anxiety, there's an article that came out in 2016 in the New York Times, an author, Seth Stevens Davidovitz. He notes this: Google searches for anxiety have increased 150% since 2004. So from 2004 to 2016. Diagnosed anxiety is 3 times as much as 2010. So by 2010 to 2016, the diagnosed anxiety rate had increased 3 times. And this is in the United States, by the way, but it holds true for the West at large. What's going on? Why are we so much more anxious? We're so much more anxious today than in 1950, and people in 1955 were so much more anxious than 1945. And the question's why. Now, let me quickly give you a few reasons that have been put out for this. People will often say that one of the reasons is because of the development of 24-hour media and then the rise of social media on the back of that. Okay, so 24-hour media. So when the news started to be broadcast, not only sometimes but always, you didn't have to go to the paper for it, you could turn the TV on for it. As that arose in the late 20th century, one of the things sociologists will point out is that we became global people in this moment in a way that we hadn't been before. Okay, so nowadays if you're a person that tries to run 24-hour media, you're willing to watch the news a lot. You're being told, let's say 3 years ago, you're saying, well, COVID-19 is racking the world. Everything's about to shut down. There's Syria. There's chemical attacks happening in Syria. The list could go on, and all of a sudden you've become a global person where you are dealing with the weight of international crises. And this is a very real thing. You were not made to deal with an international crisis. right? What were you made for? You were made to be local. We're local people, embodied souls. You are made to deal with the problems that exist in this little space that you occupy. And that's it. All right? That's how we face global challenges, is actually we only actually deal with the space that God's put us in. And so people say, well, look, you take that, you take this globalism, and then you take social media, which just causes us to perform. Right? So we put ourselves out there and we seek to perform in the public sphere, curate our identities. And you've got this call to curate your identity in a way that's delegitimized, right? Performance. And you've got the burden of international crises always on your back. It creates a heavy load. You're anxious. Okay, now, I think that's very real. I think that we need to fight to be more local people instead of global people. I think that we need to fight every instinct we have to perform on social media. All of these things can help us fight anxiety. But it can't be the base problem. Why? How do we know that media and social media is not the fundamental issue why modern people are so anxious? And it's because of what I've already said. When did the rise in clinical psychological diagnoses start to really shoot up? 1950. And in 1950, you don't have either of those things. You do not have 24-hour news media, and you do not have social media, obviously. Okay, so this is a problem that goes way back before any of this. This is exacerbating the problem. It's not the problem. All right, secondly, let's get into things that I think that are closer to home. First, I want to call one of the great problems of our age the loss of creation. The loss of creation. Modern people have lost the concept of creation. You know, we live in a universe, not creation. Creation is a religious term, right? Creation means that there is a God from which the world came. It's created. It was made, right? When you lose any sense of creation, meaning that existence comes from divine prerogative, that transcendence is the background to all of our meaning, then you lose a basic sense of purpose in life. Okay, if you live in a materialist world, you live in a world that came by chance alone, as most modern people live in their own worldview, their own mindset, you do not have fundamental external purpose. You don't. There's a loss of creation. Okay, this is the beginning of the age of anxiety, the loss of creation. It began in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, the 19th century, and we're still living in it. All right, let's build on that. The loss of creation has created a culture of boredom. Boredom. Now, what's boredom? Boredom has a classical sense and a contemporary sense. You know, my kids all the time will say, as you said 1,000 times when you were a child, and probably still do, I'm bored, right? We all do that. But boredom has a much stronger definition historically. There's actually a Greek word that was used in the Middle Ages to describe boredom. It was called acedia. It comes from classical Greek. Acedia, that's boredom. What's boredom? Boredom is not what my kids mean. A lack of stuff to do. You know, so I'm bored, I don't have anything to do. Boredom, historically speaking, is when you have frenzied activity plus purposelessness. So none of us have too little to do. That's not the modern life. The modern life is that we have too much to do. We have frenzied activity, but we've lost creation. So it's frenzied activity. We're incredibly busy. We're busier than any humans have ever been in human history, but we've lost our purpose. And so we have acedia. We have boredom. Okay? Now let's build on that a little more. When you have the loss of purpose, the loss of creation, you have frenzied activity with purposelessness, that creates a culture of consumerism. All right? The age we live in, consumerism. The one thing that ties every single culture together in the modern world is the market. Amazon is everywhere. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was a brilliant English thinker, public intellectual, Jewish rabbi, died 4 or 5 years ago. He wrote a wonderful article, I think it was in The Spectator, just before he died, saying that there's only one culture that's left, one global culture, and that global culture is the marketplace. Right? It's the marketplace. It's Amazon. It's the fact that we buy. We buy and we sell. That's what connects us all together across the world. Let me say it like this. The modern world wants you to be anxious. The market needs you to be anxious. It needs you to have purposelessness and be frenzied in your activity. It needs you to combine those two things. Why? Because discontentment and restlessness equals an incredible market. All right? So let me give you a concrete example. You don't know who you are. You don't know what your purpose is in life. But if only you had the Apple Watch 8, which is about to come out. If only you had the Apple Watch 8, then you could be consistent at the gym. You could track everything in your life. You could find your goal. You could reach your goals, right? If only you had the brand new Apple Watch. You see, loss of creation and purposelessness, not knowing who you are and what you're for from the outside, from divine definition, creates a world of boredom, frenzied activity, where the ultimate object, which you really are, is just a consumer. In other words, you're trying to find your identity through purchases. And that's exactly where the world wants you. It wants you to be anxious. It needs you to be anxious. Now, let me wrap up this point by saying this is the most important thing here. This is what's underneath all of it. What's underneath all of this problem, the problem of anxiety that we face today, is what we would call the turn to the self. This is what the philosophers call it. It's a simple idea. It sounds complicated. And that's this, that modern people understand their identity differently than anybody else in world history has. Okay? So let me give you an example of how this works out. Have you ever asked a child, or have you ever been the child that was asked, what do you want to do or be when you grow up? Anybody? Anybody ever been asked that? What do you want to be when you grow up? Right? Now look, that's a question that could have never been asked until the 19th century. No pre-modern person would have had any clue what to say. If you would have said, if you would have gone to 17th century Scotland and said to somebody, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? They'd have said, I don't understand what you're asking me. Right? Why? Well, because if you were born in 17th century Scotland, you were born into a specific clan. Your last name was set to the point where you knew exactly who you were going to be, what your vocation was going to be for your whole life, what your class was, and none of that was ever going to change. Never. Right? If you were born into a smithing family, what were you going to do? Smith. You were going to make swords. If you were born into a farming family, what were you going to do? Farm. No questions. Now, you could hope beyond hope that somebody in a class just above you might marry you, right? That would be the only way out. But other than that, there's no chance that you're ever going to change your vocational path. No, none at all. Now, for us modern people, it's completely different. Some of you are probably thinking, I changed my vocational path 3 times in the last 3 years, right? That's never existed in all of human history. This is called the turn to the self. It's the age of opportunity. Now, you take the age of opportunity, the turn to the self, which by that we simply mean you're allowed these days to curate your own identity. You can decide who you want to be. You can decide who you want to be, and it can be a complete false picture. You can paint any picture you want in the public sphere, right? Social media only adds to this. It makes us incredibly vulnerable. Vulnerable in a way that we've never been in human history. Why? Because now, for the first time ever, you are in charge of becoming who you are meant to be. All right? You're in charge. Who are you meant to be? Well, you get to decide. Who do you want to be? And you give yourself that type of opportunity to curate your own identity, to not be told from the outside who you are, to not listen to a divine being. The divine being can't tell you who you are. Right? The divine being can't even tell you if you're a man or a woman. You can choose that. In the modern world, you have so much freedom to curate your own identity that what happens? That freedom bumps up against the reality that you're a sinner, that you're a failure, that you make mistakes. If you're given that level of freedom to curate your own identity, what's going to happen? You're going to fumble. You're going to mess up. You're going to, at some point along the way, that identity is going to fall apart. And so you're forced in that moment to either change it, to go into crises, whatever it might be. In other words, you're in a position of such utter vulnerability because of the lack of purpose. Now, Christians are not immune to this. Not at all. We cannot see how much we are shaped by that culture. We have to do really hard work to understand how modern we really are. how much we are curating our own identities, how much we are existing in a space where we really think that who we are is entirely something we decide, that comes from the inside, not the outside. And that's not the way the Bible talks to us. You are the image of God. You've been given a divine mandate. You've been told exactly who you are. You've been told exactly what gender you are. You've been told all these things by God. And I would suggest to you that this age of the self, the age where we can curate our own identities, has made us so vulnerable. Because when you take sinners in an age of purposelessness and tell them, go be whoever you want to be, it ends in a state of nothing but neurotic fear. What if I fail? And we will. We will. And so that's why we live in the age of anxiety. Let me close this point by saying, and we've got to hurry here, we live in an age of great paradox because we are, as we say, autonomous individuals, self-governing, self-curating individuals who are desperately connected to the herd mentality. Right? So we determine who we are by our own choices, yet we need our choices authenticated by everybody else at the same time. And so we say we're radical individuals, yet I need you to affirm my identity. Right? You see, in other words, we know that we need outside definition, but we're looking in the wrong places for it. We're looking to each other instead of to divinity, instead of to God for it. Okay, we've got 15 minutes. What is anxiety? This is the age of anxiety. What's anxiety? Let me give you a deeper dive very quickly. We've already said anxiety is fearfulness. It's a state of fearfulness where we hypothetically construe loss. Ultimately, what's the loss? The loss of self. That's what I've just been explaining in this age we live in. And we read that into our present lives, and then it creates a fearfulness, a state of fearfulness. It triggers illness in our bodies. It triggers emotional stress in our souls. Now, Jesus comes and says something really interesting about it. He gets down and shows us exactly what he means by it. But it's not obvious on the surface of the text. So let me just give you one example for the sake of time. Matthew 6, this very famous point. This is the climax of the Sermon on the Mount, actually, when he says, do not be anxious for nothing. Now, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount up to that point, Matthew 6, when he says don't be anxious, there's a really interesting structure that you can see if you look closely. It's in the previous chapter, Matthew 5. You might remember if you've read the Bible a moderate amount of times or read through the Sermon on the Mount, there's all these negative commands that Jesus gives in Matthew 5. So he says things like, when you pray, don't look like the Pharisees. Right? So it's a negative command. Do not pray like they pray. How do they pray? Who remembers? How do the Pharisees pray? What is Jesus warning against? They stand out in the public square. They make a big show of it, right? He says, don't pray like that. Instead, go have private prayer, right? Pray to God. Don't pray as performance, right? Okay, well, then he moves on. He says, well, when you fast, don't fast like the Pharisees, right? And he says, instead, how do you fast? Well, don't whitewash your face, which is they would make themselves look like they were on their fasting day. They're miserable, they're starving. Don't do that. Fast and don't let anybody else know. It's about you and the Lord, right? There's 4 or 5 of these when you pray, when you fast. The immediate context of the anxiety command, do you remember right before he says don't be anxious? Forget about the chapters and verses and all that. That's not original. It's all squished together. He says, right before it, he says, when it comes to money, do not, here's the negative command, do not store up treasures on earth. Instead, store up your treasure in heaven. And then he says, you cannot serve 2 masters, God and Mammon, which is the name of a pagan deity for wealth. You can't serve 2 masters, all right? Very next sentence, don't be anxious. Now, the word anxiety, merimnao in the Greek, has a context that means actually to be cut in half. It's used across in other places in the Bible. That means to be separated into 2. It's like having your soul split in half. All right, now listen, he said, don't do this, do this. Don't do this, do this. Okay, don't serve the God of reputation, pray in private. Don't serve the God of reputation, fast correctly before the Lord. Don't serve the God of money, Mammon. That's a master. Instead, give your wealth to the Lord, store up your treasures in heaven, right? And then he gives you the conclusion line of all of that, not just money. You cannot do what? You can't serve how many masters? 2. You've got to be holistic. You've got to be one person with one Lord. You've got to, in other words, make your prayer life, your fasting life, your money life, your emotional life, anxiety, all a servant of the living God, the one Lord, right? Well, anxiety is the word that means, very literally, to be split between too many masters. To be cut in half is what the verb merimnao refers to. In other words, he's saying anxiety is the condition, common anxiety, I would suggest to you, is the condition of having too many masters, of serving too many things at the same time. In other words, one author puts it like this: common anxiety is a result of something in your life that has taken hold of your heart that you want more than God. It's what Tolkien called the precious, right? The ring. There's something in your life that you face hypothetical circumstances of loss over. That relationship, that person, that degree, that success, whatever it may be. And you think, if I lose that thing, I will lose my identity. Now, it gets so much worse in the modern world because you are told you have to create your own identity. You have to curate your own identity. You have to grab. You have the freedom to do that, and you have the job to do that. And then anxiety is what happens, common anxiety, whenever we love something in this world so much that we say, if I lose this, I don't know if I can keep going. That's the generalized context. Ultimately, that context is death. If I lose myself, what if I lose myself? And we read it backwards. And it's saying that this is an issue of loving something in the world more than we love the living God himself. Now, why? Here's the thesis. As we come to a close here. And I'm just going to have to list 3 or 4 ways you can fight this. And we'll have to stop. Here's the thesis. Your anxiety, your fearfulness, the state of your soul is always going to exist in proportion to the amount you love something that can be lost. Right? If what you love most in your life can be lost, you will always be anxious. You see? If what you love the most can be lost, then you will always construe hypothetical circumstances in your mind of what are the different ways I can lose this thing. And it will create a state of fearfulness. If what you love most cannot be lost, then you will be at peace. You see, if you don't serve more than one master, if you can cultivate a spirituality, a life where the one you love the most cannot be lost, then you will find a peace in your life that surpasses understanding. And that's exactly how Philippians puts it. Don't be anxious. Instead, in thanksgiving, know that there is a peace that surpasses understanding. You see, in other words, if Jesus Christ is your true treasure, your greatest love, then you love something that can never be lost, that cannot die, because he did die, and death couldn't stop him. You see, if you love him the most, then you get everything else ultimately, and you're not afraid of all the little losses. See, your fearfulness is in proportion to what you love most in life. And that's the basis of common anxiety, according to the Bible. All right, now, let me give you 3 or 4 things that you can do about it, and I'll stop talking. All right? Let me say that that there's no magic pill here. Anxiety is something that we're all to some degree going to struggle with throughout our lives. And what I want to say is that fighting anxiety is a long-term thing. It's a long-term decision that we have to make. First, understand what this problem is. Remember, I don't have time to develop this, but the spirit affects the body affects the spirit. There may be, for some of you, a situation in your life, a situation of anxiety, where you do need to treat the body in order to treat the spirit. Absolutely. So I've known people that have, gotten their thyroid taken out, and all of a sudden they went from a state of general anxiety disorder to pretty much a state of peace and calmness, right? That can be the case, okay? So as Christians, we need to say that we actually have the theological resources to understand that it may be the case that the body is affecting the soul to a great degree. And that's okay. We don't need to fight the psychologist on this, right? So there's two mistakes that can be made. There's the evangelical mistake that often happens where the anxious person comes to the pastor and he says, oh, ye of little faith. That's your issue. You don't have enough faith. Now, faith may be an issue, but it's probably not the only issue, right? It very well may be that there's a physical issue as well, right? So we never need to be afraid as Christians to say that. Why? Because God created us as psychosomatic wholes, embodied souls, and that soul and body are both cursed. They're both cursed. They're both underneath the domain of sin. So we don't need to be afraid of understanding something like that. All right, secondly, let me say that one of the long-term things that we have to do, not only to fight anxiety, but as Christians. Okay, so if you're a Christian today, this is what you came to this weekend conference for, what I'm about to say. Okay, here it is. You've got to think a lot more about your own death. So if this is what you can take away. Christians have got to think a lot more, I think, about their own death. And the reason for that is because, simply in terms of anxiety is created in the context, as we said earlier, of facing that ultimate loss and reading that loss backwards into all the little losses, the things that we love in life. For that reason alone, we've got to talk about death. And I think we've got to talk about it a lot more than modern people want to. It's another condition of modernity that we relate to death in such a different way than pre-modern people did. Okay, we don't see it very often. It's behind closed doors. People die in spaces that the public never see, that we never see. That is not at all what pre-modern life was like. People from the earliest age saw death all the time. It was around them all the time. And for that reason alone, I think people in the pre-modern world had less anxiety than we do because they understood death. They faced it regularly. We could talk a lot about this. Let me just say one thing. Prayer is one of the great preparations for death. How? When you pray, you are saying, I'm not in control. I'm vulnerable. I'm mortal. I'm coming to the one that is not and asking for help. Prayer is actually the recognition of death, that my mortality stands. And baptism, have you been baptized? Baptism is the beginning of our preparation for death. In baptism, we go under the waters of death and we come back up again, but we recognize that that's what we have to pass through to see life. We have to drown. We have to go under the waters of judgment in order to see life again. And baptism is the beginning where we say, I exist to die to myself. I exist to die to the life I thought I was going to live. My own personal choices. The curation of my own identity. I'm dying to that. Baptism is the pronouncement that you are to die to those desires, to conform to an outside definition, to be given a mission from the outside. You see, the Christian life is death to everything. It's death to who you thought you were going to be. It's death to your sin nature. And ultimately, it's physical death that leads to life. And if death is the ultimate context of our anxiety, we've got to pray about it. We've got to think about it. We've got to look at what the Bible says about it. And we've got to reckon with it and be able to say with the Apostle Paul, death, where is thy sting? It's the great fear. And so it's a fear that we've really got to face and we really got to encounter. Okay, I can't say more. I can't give you much more detail. Let me give you two more and we'll stop. Third, in the light of that, let me say, in your personal spiritual life, your Christian spirituality, as we call it, thinking more about death, praying more about death, understanding the relation between the body and the soul more. These are all important. This is most important, what I'm about to say. Probably you're not thinking enough about the beatific vision. Okay, what's that? The beatific vision. This is our theological term, classically, of understanding our ultimate purpose. The beatific, the beautiful vision. What is your ultimate hope? And the Bible tells us very clearly, it is to see the living God in the face of Jesus Christ. Okay, so one day, if you're a Christian, you are going to see God. David says this in Psalm 27, Lord, my greatest wish is that I would see the beauty of your face in the land of the living. There it is, the beatific vision, the blessed vision. You will see the beauty of the face of the Lord in the land of the living, and you will be completely fulfilled. Every desire, every hope, every dream, completely fulfilled. Pray that God would help you to want that more than anything. This may be the missing piece in our Christian lives, that we don't ask God to help us want the beatific vision. It's the one thing that you were made for above all else. You've got to cultivate a desire in your life where you say, I want God. I want to see the beauty of the face of the Lord more than anything. Now, plenty of times you don't want that. You want something else. You want more money in your bank account. You just want to play Fortnite, whatever it may be, more than the beatific vision. And that's why you've actually got to fight for this in your spiritual life. You've got to pray for it. You've got to ask God for it. You've got to seek it. You've got to seek, because as you seek it, your desires will change. Remember anxiety, the problem? You will be anxious to the degree that the thing you want most in life can be lost. If you desire to see the beauty of the face of the Lord in the land of the living above anything else, then not even death can make you anxious. You see? Because you want to pass through so you can see the beauty of the face of the Lord in the land of the living. And then your anxieties are quelled. Death, where is thy sting? You see, that's how it works. Now, lastly, let me just close by saying that means that the magic pill, the secret to fighting anxiety as a Christian is actually spiritual discipline. It's spiritual discipline. It really is. It's not, it's prayer. It's beholding the face of God through the Word of God. It's simple. It's not exciting in a way maybe that you want. It's praying your fears, as David does in Psalm 27. David in Psalm 27 says, "What if my mother and father forsake me?" You see what he's doing? Hypothetical imagination of circumstances of loss. What if this army encamps against me? What if my own mom and dad forsake me for my son, Absalom, or whoever it may be? He says, oh, Lord, may I want to see you in the land of the living more than anything. You see, he's doing it. He's becoming anxious, and then he immediately prays his fears before the Lord. He says, I'm anxious. I'm giving it away to you. It's daily prayer. It's daily meditation on the true hope, our true love, the beauty of the face of the Lord. It's Christian spirituality. That's the secret. Pursuing it. All right, so I'll just give the Apostle Paul the last word. Philippians 4:4-7. Cast your cares upon him because he cares for you. Do not be anxious. Cast your cares upon him because he cares for you. All right. 5 minutes early, Molly. Shall I pray?
Yes.
Lord, we give thanks that you treat all of who we are in the Bible. And I ask for these folks here that I do not know well, that you would bless them with the peace that surpasses understanding. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.